Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Eclectic Reader. So today I'm doing my wrap-up of all the books that I read in the month of February. I read 4 books, which is actually quite a good amount for me. I don't usually read more than 5 books in a month. At least not books that I would be talking about on this channel. I might read a few books that are academic in nature and that are really hard to get unless you have access to a research library, and also you probably wouldn't read them anyway because they are just so specific and specialized that they're really only consulted if you're doing, well, my research, then you would consult it. So these are the 4 books that I would like to talk about, and I will just go in order from the first book that I read to the last book that I read in the month of February. So the first book that I read is Kilt, which is book number 12 in the Liz McCrimmon series by Caitlin Dunnett. Now, I have not read the other 11 books in the series. I read cozy mystery books out of order, and in my experience, it doesn't matter where you start in a series, or rather, it shouldn't matter if the author has done a good job. Because while you might be rewarded by reading the entire series from beginning to end, if you start anywhere in the middle, usually it's not a problem, and I can jump right in and just follow the characters, and I usually don't have an issue. So this was the case with this book, and I do look forward to reading the other books in this series. I think there are even books that have been written since Kilt. But Liz McCrimmon, who is our protagonist sleuth, she runs a store called the Scottish Emporium, and her husband and her father-in-law run this hotel. And the hotel is having a special for childless couples during Valentine's Day. And this sparks a firestorm of protests from far-right religious organizations that feel as if this hotel is catering towards same-sex couples and cohabiting couples, and so they're living in sin, and there's like all of this controversy surrounding this hotel. Now, I usually don't have an issue with cozies that deal with more controversial material, but I understand that that's not for everyone, especially because the whole point of a cozy is to escape from the world. But I actually think that sometimes it's a good thing for a cozy to deal with more controversial issues. This book was written, I think, in 2018, so same-sex marriage was even more controversial than it is today. I think it's becoming more and more accepted, even by people who didn't accept it before. But at the center of the controversy is essentially a cult that calls themselves the New Age Pilgrims. And when I first heard the name, I thought New Age, that sounds more like New Age spirituality. But actually, they're like the Westboro Baptist Church meets the Amish. So they dress like Amish or Mennonites, but at the same time, they're like very nasty, and they're protesting, and they can get like physically violent, verbally violent, which the Anabaptists, being pacifists, don't do. So that was the thing that kind of annoyed me a bit, because there was really no theological reason for the mix and match of different churches here. It didn't work for me as somebody who is quite familiar with the various branches of Christianity. That being said, we are essentially following a cult, and the cult leader is named Hadley Spinner. And there is a fair that's put on in the town, and Hadley Spinner is found dead on a Ferris wheel with a knife in his back. Liz McCrimmon, she's also a very nosy protagonist. She's sometimes unlikable. I think she can be quite judgmental and nosy and gets involved in a lot of things, but actually her mother is probably worse. So they team up and they decide that they're going to investigate and figure out who murdered Hadley Spinner. I think that for the most part this was a really great book. I gave it 4 stars. Yes, there were a few things that got in the way of my enjoyment of the book. I did not actually guess the murderer, and so I was actually pleasantly surprised by the ending. And so I would recommend it if you're interested in a fun cozy, but also a cozy that maybe deals with more difficult topics. And I also want to point out that the town in which this takes place is Moose Tookaluk. And there's also a town called Mooseside. And because I love moose, they're my favorite animals, I had to pick up the book. That's literally the only reason why I picked up this book. And now I will continue the series. The second book that I read is The King Must Die by Mary Renault. So this is the first Mary Renault that I read, and Mary Renault is most famous for writing myth retellings. Now, myth retellings are all the rage today, but she actually wrote these books in the 1950s, so well before Circe or The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, which, by the way, I would like to read at some point. I do want to read the more modern myth retellings, because some of the issues that I found in this book, I think, would be addressed in the more modern myth retellings. So this is a retelling of the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. So Theseus, who is believed to have been the son of Poseidon, he survives a labyrinth and kills the Minotaur. Basically, Mary Renault does maintain the essential elements. Theseus leaves his hometown. He travels to a variety of places. He actually becomes a king of a land that is governed by women. And Theseus is super misogynistic. And because he's our narrator, we're in his head the whole time. That's very unpleasant. And while I'm okay with unpleasant, unreliable narrators, I think that they can be really interesting to follow. It did get tiring at times because he gets really nasty towards women. And I think it's also surprising, the author being a woman, that she would write a book like this. I think that today, in myth retellings, the stories really give voice to the experience of the women. But Theseus is the one whom we follow, and he is perfect. He basically succeeds at everything. At times, this book really dragged, especially in the parts of the story that are the most exciting. You know, the labyrinth scenes. I was actually quite bored. I wish that it would pick up the pace. Eventually it did, and I do think that it was a solid 3-star book, but I don't feel like continuing this series. It's actually a duology. There's a sequel to this book. I will not be reading the sequel. I think I want to read her books on Alexander the Great. Fire in Heaven, I think, is the first book. I do want to read that instead. Mary Renault is a beautiful writer. She has an amazing prose style. And I just love how she incorporated epic similes into her book. And so on that level, it is quite masterful, but it did disappoint me a bit by its pacing and also just by the misogyny in the story that was never really criticized. And at no point do women confront Theseus on his views, but also it makes sense. Theseus, being a man of his time, would have been extremely misogynistic. So I guess in that sense, it is pretty accurate for the time in which the story takes place. The third book that I read is Engaged in Death, which is the first book in the Wedding Planner Mystery series by Stephanie Blackmore, and I gave this book 5 stars. This was the February pick for the Courtagianist Book Club. So, the story follows Mallory, who works at a law firm, and at the beginning of the story, she's engaged to a boy named Keith, except his mother has controlled everything. She has completely changed their plans for the wedding. Even though Mallory is the one who's footing the bill, she's just completely giving in to everything that the mother-in-law wants, and the mother-in-law is like the mother-in-law from hell, right? So in the beginning of the story, I was not at all impressed by the protagonist because she was basically a doormat. She was letting her future mother-in-law walk all over her, and Keith too was a doormat and did not stand up for Mallory at all throughout the process, and that really annoyed me. But Keith cheats on Mallory, and Mallory dumps him, and from then on, she grows a backbone, and she becomes a completely different protagonist. The switch is a little bit too extreme. I mean, from someone who allowed herself to be walked all over to someone with a backbone, I thought that was a pretty dramatic shift. But also, I preferred her after the breakup. She inherits a house from Keith's grandmother, Sylvia. So Sylvia had been in a nursing home, and Mallory and Sylvia got along really, really well. Sylvia did not get along with the rest of the family. Keith and his mother never visited the grandmother, Sylvia. So when she passed away, she gives her historic mansion to Mallory. And as you might imagine, Keith, and especially his mother, are very angry. They think that that was unfair and they want to fight it. So there is this legal aspect to things. Now, this house is on some very valuable land. The oil company would like to use it for fracking purposes, but Sylvia always opposed fracking. And so Mallory decides to respect her wishes and not allow the agent from the oil company to buy her house or to use her land in any way for fracking. And then he's suddenly found dead in the front lawn. So Mallory has a lot to deal with. First, because she already paid for the reception, she needs to find somebody to replace her, basically. And now she is a suspect in a murder case, and also she's dealing with Keith and his mother, who want to take the house that Sylvia gave to Mallory. And then her sister, Rachel, who seems to have a lot of difficulties holding down a job. She's quite the rebel. She's like the opposite of Mallory. Rachel cares a lot about her sister and visits her, and she basically starts living with Mallory, and she has plans of her own about what she would like to happen to the house. So there's a lot going on in this book. I had such a good time. Even though this book is called Engaged in Death, most of the book is actually not about weddings. I think the other books in the series are, but this book is not mostly about weddings. It's mostly about the house and the secrets that the house might be keeping. It was a lot of fun. I really liked Mallory eventually, and then Rachel is just such a spunky, rebellious figure, but also someone who has some really creative ideas. So I really look forward to following them in the rest of the series. And I do recommend that you join the Cortagenous Book Club if you are interested in cozy mysteries and you want to read cozy mysteries with others. I had a really great time. I will link the live show below in case you read the book and you want to hear what she had to say and others had to say about the book. And the final book that I read is From Equity Talk to Equity Walk. This is actually more of an academic book. It's written by a series of authors. I will link all the books below. I gave it 4 stars. This was a book that I read because I want to understand how to be a more equity-minded teacher, because I have taught college French for 4 years and currently I am tutoring, and this is a sector that I want to continue to be in after I finish my doctorate. There were several things that I gathered from this book. First, that it's really important to disaggregate data, particularly by race, to understand the ways in which schools disproportionately help certain racial groups over others. It talks about why it is important to focus on race in higher education. I know that this is a book that would be quite controversial, but also I think really important because diversity, equity, and inclusion are buzzwords nowadays in higher education. And what this book tries to do is get beyond the buzzwords and say, okay, but what does it practically mean to be equity-minded? So I learned a lot from this book, and I will link below a blog post that I wrote where I talked about my 5 takeaways. So if you are interested in higher education and you want to know more about how to be a better teacher, I do recommend this book, and I do recommend that you check out my blog post. So those are the books that I read in the month of February, and my March TBR is already up, so I will link that below. Thank you everybody for watching, and if you are new here, I hope that you will subscribe and stick around. Bye now.